This is Civil War Talk Radio. I'm Jerry Prokopovich. When we read about Sherman's march from Atlanta to the sea, the books tell us that his force consisted of four corps, two on the right under Howard, two on the left under Slocum. But they say very little about the Fifth Corps, as big as any of the others, that had been marching almost invisibly through history until now. In a remarkable new book, Dr. Bennett Parten focuses attention on the tens of thousands who walked behind or along or amongst Sherman's army out of slavery and into freedom, and how they permanently transformed the social landscape of the South. The book is called Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. And we'll talk with author Bennett Parten tonight on Civil War Talk Radio. And welcome to Civil War Talk Radio. I'm Jerry Prokopovich, coming to you as usual from the third floor of the Brewster Building on the campus of East Carolina University, home of the team that won last year's Military Bowl back in December 2024. It's now December of 2025, and I'm not speaking for the Military Bowl or the ECU football team or anybody, just myself, and our guest will do likewise, as we've done for the past 20 plus years here at Civil War Talk Radio. Well, Happy New Year to all. It is the first show of 2025. It's an exciting time here at Civil War Talk Radio, not just because the Pirates won their bowl game or my alma mater, Michigan, won their bowl game, but the big national story, the one everyone is following, is that Civil War Talk Radio is moving. If you've been listening along for the last 20 years or so, you know that we have always had our shows produced by Voice America, or World Talk Radio, they were called at one time. And now with the show about to turn 21 and become an adult and enter independence, our relationship here at Civil War Talk Radio and Voice America is coming to an amicable end. So within the next week or so, all of our back episodes will be moved from Voice America's site to Libsyn, Libsyn. That hopefully will be invisible to the listener. You won't have to worry about it if you use the links at impedimentsofwar.org. We are keeping them all updated, so they'll take you to the shows wherever they are being stored. We are making this change. Why are we making this change, you ask eagerly? The reason is that Voice America charges its other show hosts. You hear those commercials all the time about, self-improvement and businesses and survivalism and personal relationships and things none of us care about. Voice America charges those hosts hundreds of dollars for each episode for the deluxe services that it provides them. And they've never charged us that because we provided them with content back in the day when they had no other shows. And so they gave us a deal, we gave them content, everybody was happy. But times have changed. They've got plenty of shows, and they've decided that Civil War Talk Radio should also pay hundreds of dollars weekly, which, given that I teach at a regional public university. I'm not wallowing in hundreds of dollars of spare cash a week to bring these stories to you, to talk to you about Civil War books as much as I enjoy it. Uh, but fortunately, Civil War Talk Radio doesn't need the deluxe services that Voice America or its similar institutions provide. Uh, we really need only a few things. A hosting site doesn't cost too much, some basic sound engineering. I'm looking for a student on campus to provide us with that. Uh, so it doesn't make sense for us to stay in a high-priced commercial lineup. And Aaron, our contact, our friend at Voice America, has very graciously agreed to help with the transition to move Civil War Talk Radio's catalog of shows over to Libsyn and to start fresh there. So it's been a very mutually satisfactory decision to move on. And it brings some good news for us, which means we will not actually have the commercials for other Voice America shows during this show any longer, or any other irrelevant messages. I listened last week, and there have been some other changes. I heard a McDonald's commercial at the start of the show. I don't need that, I can tell you, and you probably don't either. So we won't be going there. We're not turning into a commercial enterprise, but we will need a few dollars a month going forward to pay a hosting fee, to pay a penurious graduate student at ECU to engineer the shows, to make a few things happen. So in the future, I will actively be looking for interesting and worthwhile sponsors for the show. Um, Things that hopefully you'll be interested in hearing about, Civil War related sites, products, activities, things that are of interest to the whole community, not fast food restaurants, for example. And I'll be asking you, the listener, to please continue to contribute to the book and bourbon fund, as we have called it over the years. Now the book, bourbon, and basic expenses fund, as that money will be shunted away from comestibles and into paying to keep the wolf from the door. So I hope you can see your way toward doing that as we go into 2025. So it is a new year. We'll say out with the old. This tonight is our last episode being engineered by Voice America. I really do want to thank Aaron Keller and everybody at Voice America who has supported the show for so long and kept us under the radar of our corporate overlords at Voice America. The bean counters there would have had us paying them long ago, except for people like Aaron. So thank you for that. And out with the old and in with the new. Our first sponsor in the new year is our old friend, the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. This year, the Civil War Institute is set up for June 13 to 18. There will be great names, familiar names, people you've heard on this show. Gary Gallagher, Kent Masterson Brown, Carol Reardon, Jennifer Murray, Caroline Janey, Aaron Sheehan Dean, Joseph Gladar, Scott Hartwig. All of them have been on the show, and all great scholars and good speakers, and just fun to talk to. There's lots of things to do at the Institute. If you haven't been, I've recommended it before, and I'm doing it again. Dine-in opportunities where you get to actually sit and have lengthy conversations on specific topics with the faculty members there. Tour opportunities on the battlefield at Gettysburg and elsewhere. And just being among a couple hundred people who share an interest in our historical topic is a great way to spend a few days. They are sponsoring the show in that if you donate, you make a single donation of $50 to the show through the Impediments of War website, where you can find the PayPal button, or if you make a recurring monthly contribution in any amount, and if you just make it a dime, you have to live with yourself. Um, but if you're already a recurring sponsor, a recurring donor, or if you start becoming one, I'll get you the discount code of 15% this year off the tuition and housing at Civil War Institute. And I'm not a mathematician, but I believe if you make a modest monthly donation, you will double or almost triple your savings when you take that 15% uh, deduction at Civil War Institute. So there's an opportunity. When you see fit to contribute to the show, as I said a moment ago, go to impedimentsofwar.org, the show's website. Hit the PayPal button there. Mark Gaffney is operating the site. He continues to do so, done an outstanding job keeping ahead of the changes as we move our shows from one host to another. He and his team of himself have done all this work, and I'm very grateful for that. You can also find out when you're there who's coming up on the show next. Next week, Douglas R. Edgerton returns to the show with his new biography of Thomas Wentworth Higginson. It's called A Man on Fire, not related to the Hunger Games girl on fire, I am certain. On January 29th, Robert D. Hicks will be here. His book is called Wounded for Life: Seven Union Veterans of the Civil War. And it's an unusual book. I think you'll find it interesting. On February 5th, we bring back Alan Gelzo, who has been on the show once long ago, and I'm glad to have him back. He's written a book called Our Ancient Faith: Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment. I'm very curious to talk to him about that. We are still working on our Lincoln Day show, February 12th, but after that, David Welker will be here with his talking about African American intelligence contributions during the Civil War, the use of the use made by the federal forces of African American intelligence agents within the enslaved and free communities. And then on the 26th of February, Patrick Lewis, another returnee to the show, is co-editor of a book called Playing at War: Identity and Memory in Civil War Video Games. I don't play the video games, but I'm really interested to find out what those games are about. And we'll give one more. March 5th, Derek Brown, operations manager from the Bentonville Battlefield State Historic Site, will be here to chat about that battle. So lots coming up in the year ahead. In March, I'll be speaking in Milwaukee and Chicago at the Civil War Roundtables in the second week of March. Tell you more about that later. There's the This Hallowed Ground tours coming up with Stephen Amber's Historical Tours, May 10th through 23rd. That one is full, but you can get on the wait list, and people do drop out. Things happen. You never know. And there are open spaces still on the tour June 14 to 22nd. And I just found out I'm doing that one too. I'm very pleased about that. And so I'll hopefully see some of you there if you're not at Civil War Institute, June 13 through 18. So lots going on. Let's get to our guest tonight, Bennett Parten. He is a professor at the book, Georgia Southern University, and has written a new book called Somewhere Toward Freedom: Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. Dr. Parten, are you there?
I am.
Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So, do you go by Bennett? Ben, what's
I go by Ben. Yeah, please call me Ben.
okay?
By Bennett just so people don't assume Benjamin, actually. So,
I hear you. I'm Jerry. Please call me that. But Gerald on the book covers,
sure.
um, just to be sure. So this book, I've gotten a number of recommendations about this book. Once in a while, there will be a book where you get this buzz in advance, people saying, "Oh, you need to read this," or listeners have emailed me and said, "You got to have this guy on the show." As far away as Ireland, people writing saying, "You got to have this guy on the show," and I said, "He's coming up." Look at the blurbs on the back. As you know, we never actually read the blurbs on the back. No one writes a lukewarm thing on the back unless they're been
Right.
been forced into it. You just look at who they are. Did they get the first team or the second team. And you've got David Blight, Elizabeth Barron, Orville Vernon Burton. You've got the first team on the back of your book. Um, so my first question about it is, was this originally a dissertation?
That's right. It was. Yeah, it was a dissertation project.
That 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 leads immediately to the second question. Um, the book is published by Simon and Schuster,
Uh-huh.
which is a trade press, and I'm as a public historian, I'm a big fan of us getting books out into the hands of the reading public and using trade presses to do that. But if you're an assistant professor, then you're on the tenure track, and your committee is going to be saying, "Where's your academic press book?" Um, what made you decide to go this route?
Well, thank you for that. And I agree. I think it's important for us to be reaching a wider, broader audience with our writing and our research. And the truth of the matter is that that was something I've always felt very strongly about. And even from the very beginning of this project, when it began as a dissertation, I have to credit my dissertation advisor, in this case, David Blight, because I went to him and I told him that I would like to write this dissertation as a broad narrative history, and
Mhm.
ideally like to land it in a public-facing commercial trade press. And he said, "Go for it." He slapped me on the back and he said, you write the book that you want to write, and I'll support you." And it meant the world to me then, and it still means the world to me now. And so a lot of credit to him for doing that and really opening doors to allow it to happen. But it's important, I believe strongly in what you just said, right, about trying to reach a broader audience. But I also knew too that the story that I had on my hand was a big one. It's a story of movement. It was in some ways a natural story with a beginning and an end, so I thought, in Savannah. And I always felt too that the only way to really do this story justice and to capture all the movement, all the people, the drama of it all was to write narrative history, classic narrative history. And
It,
so, sure.
yeah, it reads that way. It has the sound um, of classic narrative history, which often is the form that popular history takes, uh, with the difference that it's written by an academically trained historian, fully referenced at the back, but it it's just an interesting hybrid. It's a small book. Uh, when I was coming through grad school, the fashion was to write 400 or 500 page dissertations. It's very intimidating, uh, not useful at all, if you ask me. And fortunately, that has changed, and a lot of them are shorter. But this is a book that a non required reader, that is not someone who doesn't have to read it for a course, could pick up, read it, enjoy it, and finish it in a couple of days. It's not a long book, and the footnotes are just to the point. They're not discursive. They're not historiographical. For the most part, they're just there. They're brief, so it doesn't fit the model.
Sure. Sure. Well, it's funny you say that about the length, because it was actually much larger as a dissertation project. I am guilty of that.
Okay.
But my editor at Simon Schuster, Bob Bender, was really fantastic and really helped me and encouraged me to winnow down some of the different parts of it. And funny enough, I took that really as license to really do some heavy editing. So in different versions of this, it was much longer.
Okay. Well, that's reassuring then. Um, well, I won't press you further on what will lie in store, uh, but I want to be a fly on the wall of your tenure committee, because on the one hand, there's going to be some old dinosaur saying, "Well, the young man did not publish with a university press," and someone else saying, "For gosh sakes, David Blight supervised this dissertation," and you're trying to drag us back into the 60s and 70s. Get with it, man. I just picture that debate happening, and I hope your side wins. Um,
Yeah, I have had some conversations. Unfortunately, my home institution, Georgia Southern, has been really supportive of me, and I've got some
that's good.
great people in my corner. So It was a concern going in. I won't, pretend that it wasn't, but I
Mhm.
think everything should be okay. And I've gotten some really great support from my colleagues and from my department.
Well, that is good to hear. Uh, Listeners are saying, well, okay, you've talked about the book. Tell us what's in the book. And we're going to do that after we take a short break. Before we do that, I'm going to make one more observation. This book has one of the most interesting covers, dust jackets. I haven't actually looked at the cover. Let's see what's on the cover. Blue cover. Um, the dust jacket is this matte finish of the most matte finished book cover I may have ever run my fingertips across. Uh, did you have any say in the graphics or production of this, or is this what Simon and Schuster did?
It is what Simon Schuster did, and it was the image or the dust jacket cover was proposed to me, and I could have made edits if I wanted to, I
Mhm.
suppose. But my editor, Bob Bender, who I think was really the kind of guiding hand behind the production of the book before his retirement earlier last year, I think really did a fantastic job. And I think it's a strong cover, and I supported it. So I was really pleased with the way it turned out. So a lot of credit to Simon Schuster for its production.
It did come out nicely. So we are going to talk about the very interesting contents of this book. When we come back, we'll take a short break. Uh, I'm talking tonight with Bennett Parten. I'm Jerry Prokopovich. This is Civil War Talk Radio. And welcome back to Civil War Talk Radio. I'm Jerry Prokopovich. We're talking about the book Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation, with the author Bennett Parten here on Civil War Talk Radio. Talked about the book as a book. It's published by Simon and Schuster, a noted trade press. Uh, and so it's an interesting hybrid of an uh, uh, academically trained scholar writing a book, fully footnoted, but writing it for a wider audience than just us listening to this show tonight, uh, but not moving beyond us. That is, we've had popular historians on the show who've written books where they spent 18 months researching the book and now they're experts, and there's not always that much there for you and me. This one is different. The general topic is in the subtitle. The Sherman's March is the story of America's largest emancipation. Ben, how is it that historians have missed for 150 years the tens of thousands of people hiding in plain sight that are participating in Sherman's march, but they're not actually members of his army, or they're not soldiers at least.
Yeah.
How has it been missed, and how did you find it?
Yeah, well, I think that there's maybe two points to raise in response to that. One, I think, is just the challenge of sources.
Mhm.
Enslaved people leave few written records, and certainly enslaved people on the move as refugees in an environment like Sherman's March, I think does isn't really one that lends itself to a large amount of written records. And to find it, you've got to really dig through military records as well as plenty of soldiers' accounts, which is what I end up doing for the project. But the other, Jerry, I think is just this long-standing kind of hold that Sherman's March as a military experience has had on the historiography and our popular memory of what the march was. I was always under the assumption that the debates about whether or not Sherman's March represented a instance of total war,
Hmm.
uh, grievances of the White South, Sherman's cult of personality, has always kept us sort of privileging our popular memory in a way that focuses on, Sherman, his personality to write the soldiers in the march as a military event, as I said. But the idea for the book really struck me when I was a young graduate student, actually reading a work of fiction. I'm sure some of your listeners would be familiar with E.L. Doctorow's great work of fiction on Sherman's March called simply The March.
Hmm.
Uh, and as was Doctorow's style, he wrote with a real cast of characters in mind. But one of his characters in that book is a freedwoman named Wilma Jones, who drops everything, follows the army, and arrives with Sherman's army in Savannah. You later find out that Wilma Jones is related to another character that appears in another one of his books, but I won't spoil that or go any further.
Okay.
But it struck me that Wilma Jones was a composite character, that she wasn't a singular character at all. There were likely many tens of, or hundreds, if not thousands, of Wilma Joneses. Add in that with the way that Dr. O described Savannah as a city sort of with an influx of people experiencing this refugee movement. And I immediately began wondering about how we could potentially write a historical account of the many Wilma Joneses who might have arrived in Savannah. So that's a real quick sort of origin story about where this book began. And the truth of the matter is, as I began to research, I realized that there were, in fact, many thousands of Wilma Joneses. And
Hmm.
when Sherman arrives in Savannah, he speculates even that there are about 20,000 refugees from slavery following his army. And that is a substantial number. It's about the size of Savannah itself, which is Georgia's largest city in 1860, and it's double the size of Atlanta in 1860.
Hmm.
So we're talking about a movement that is the size of a large southern city, and that doesn't even account for the people who might have run to the army and then turned back, or run to the army and decided not to follow. And it certainly doesn't account for all the many thousands of people who experienced freedom as a consequence of this campaign. So it's once I started digging into these numbers more, I really began to realize that I had a story on my hands.
When I started reading this, made me think of Amy Morrell Taylor's book on the refugee camps, where she's finding the locations of refugee camps of freed people across the South with populations in the numbers you just quoted, tens up to hundreds of thousands. And they're not marked today. There's no, we know where every battlefield is. There's a Civil War trails marker, there's a National Park Service site, and these moving cities of freed people have just been, you know, lost to the map until she started pointing out where they were. And you're doing the same thing. What will be next? This is an interesting movement to reclaim these huge movements that that have just fallen out of our vision. Let me ask about the concept of jubilee that you raise early on in the book. Um, you use it at the start, you come back to it at the end. What does that word mean?
Yeah, so just Jubilee itself refers to an Old Testament idea found in Leviticus. And it is a moment in which God instructs the ancient Israelites to observe a period of social renewal once every 50 years, though there's some real deep Old Testament scholars who would debate whether it's the 49th year or the 50th year.
Hmm.
Well, we'll go into that, but nonetheless, it is a term that signifies a period of social renewal, a period in which enslaved people are let free, large estates are divided amongst people in equitable plots, all debts are absolved, and the fields are to lay fallow for a full calendar year so that the earth can regenerate itself. And this is a really interesting idea. It becomes a rallying cry amongst labor radicals in the early 19th century. It becomes a metaphor for the abolitionist movement who long for some sort of universal emancipation, which is influenced by their deep belief in a coming millennium. But it's important in this story because enslaved people who for much of the 19th century had been fashioning and refashioning different versions of Christianity to meet their own needs, and later to become a real cornerstone of the culture of enslaved communities, really latch on to Jubilee as a way to understand and make sense and articulate what is happening around them as Sherman's army comes through. Um, as I describe in the book, I found it in so many different instances. In many cases, it enslaved people invoking the idea. In some cases, it's soldiers saying that this is what is happening. And then certainly it's found in the very famous song Marching Through Georgia,
Hmm.
uh, which references bringing the Jubilee to the enslaved people of Georgia. And so it is a very powerful idea that helps enslaved people, I think, make sense of this moment. And then when we think the thing that always struck me as interesting about it is when we think about what happens on the coast with the initial attempt at land reform, though we can talk about how complicated that is. It certainly seems, if you are an enslaved person, that aspects of this biblical jubilee seems to be coming true. And so, sure, go ahead.
Well, I say you sort of hint at the uh, there's a tragedy that lies ahead. Spoiler alert, listeners, if you want to read the book and not know how it ends, don't listen to the rest of this. But there are highs and lows in the story. That I think one of the reasons Civil War study can be so popular and so gratifying is that it does have a redemptive quality to it. That it does end not just with national unification, but with the legal extermination of slavery, and that's a good story. And Jubilee is a good thing, but your story is not nearly that simple.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely, certainly not. And that was always a difficult thing in writing this project, which is there are moments of real triumphalism, moments where there is real ideas about, um, justice being served, right? And it is a moment of liberation. But there are also very tragic and very dark moments. I mean, this is one of the complicated aspects of emancipation as a lived experience, which is that it was an experience of incredible highs and incredible lows, and an experience that was always uncertain, always unstable, and rarely all that secure. The title of the book is Somewhere Toward Freedom.
Mhm.
That comes from a soldier himself who recognizes that or it comes from, excuse me, a enslaved person responding to a question by a soldier. And I think in part it embodies the recognition that the freedom that these enslaved people were running to and trying to seek was always very ill defined. And so, your question is right. Is this is a was a project to write that is full of moments of real, triumph, but also
Mhm.
moments of real tragedy and a lot of gray area in between, quite frankly.
You cautioned us about indulging in the Sherman cult of personality, and I'm looking down and say, "Oh, I'm wearing my Civil War talk radio T-shirt with a picture of Sherman and a boombox on his shoulder." Um, so I'm guilty of that. And listeners, you can be too. You can go to tpublic.com and purchase your own Sherman Civil War Talk Radio T-shirt. There, we're gonna have commercials like that now. Um, uh, but Sherman is a central figure in your book, and his he certainly seems ambivalent about the Freedom Project. Is that a fair word to use?
Absolutely. I think that's a very appropriate word to use. He is a real sliding scale when it comes to this, and that might be being somewhat generous, but I'll explain what I
Hmm.
mean. What I mean by that is Sherman is someone who opens the war, as someone who does not see slavery as having a central place in it whatsoever. He sees it as a question of national integrity and preserving the Union first and foremost. And he sees secession as really the principal sort of evil here. And he has no interest at all in emancipation or upsetting slavery. I mean, remember, this is a man who'd spent significant parts of his life in Louisiana, who was teaching at what is now LSU before the war
Mhm.
begins. And had even speculated with his wife about purchasing enslaved people to serve in his household. And so Sherman is someone who's unbothered by the institution of slavery. And then as the war evolves, he also becomes a great resistor of the war's evolution. He writes wonderful letters with his brother John, who is a U.S. senator, who supports the Confiscation Acts and supports emancipation, basically taking him to task for not understanding what emancipation looks like on the ground. And every step of the way, Sherman is a real resistor to this evolution and then a real reluctant liberator at best. But I think ambivalence is a good term to use because by 1864, he has evolved some.
Mhm.
Whereas previously he didn't see slavery as having a central place in this conflict. By 1864, he now does recognize that targeting slavery is a way to target the Confederacy and ultimately defeat the Confederacy. And as much as he might be a reluctant liberator and a resistor of the war's evolution, he also recognizes that being a liberator and styling himself as such in some respects is good for him politically, and that he can use this to fend off the many challenges to his authority and to his reputation that do come or that has already come and that will come in the future. And so he is deeply ambivalent. And then certainly on the march, we see more of this ambivalence at play. Before pushing out of Atlanta, he gives his army orders that the enslaved people they meet on the march may be taken along with them, but
Mhm.
only if the enslaved people are able-bodied and able to work. But he also cautions and says that the officer's first responsibility is to his own troops and the ability to make the march unencumbered. And this is notable in part because it's highly ambiguous. It doesn't really tell his men really anything specific at all. It refers to labor, which Sherman always viewed as a precondition or a condition of refuge or some kind of freedom within his army's lines. But I think more importantly, I think it assumes that the army itself will be the ultimate arbiters of what emancipation looks like during the campaign to Savannah. And one of the things that he finds out really quickly is that enslaved people themselves are going to be arbiters of this process. And then much of what happens during the march is really this kind of push and pull, this tug of war between the army and its movements, and then enslaved people always sort of mirroring and moving towards the army. And it's certainly by Milledgeville, about the halfway point of the march, it's very clear that enslaved people are responding to the army and running to the army no matter what their directives are.
So the agency is certainly divided here among the people who are freeing themselves and the army that is making it possible for them to do that. They don't necessarily have the same goals. Sometimes they coincide, sometimes they don't. Now, sometimes the soldiers don't want people to accompany them. You point out actually there are a lot not just following the army, but in the army, cooking and cleaning and serving and doing things with the soldiers. But a lot of them get turned away and they end up following along behind anyway. And that gets us to, well, clearly the ugliest single moment in the book, I would say, is what happens at Ebenezer Creek. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So Ebenezer Creek is, I think, absolutely the darkest, most tragic moment during the Savannah campaign in regards to this story. And it happens in part because of one of Sherman's corps commanders, Jeff C. Davis, who is not Jeff F. Davis, just to be clear about that. And Davis has the route through Georgia that slopes closest to the Savannah River. And this is important because it means that his route is going to cover the swampiest terrain and the terrain that is most riven by rivers and bayous and these intercoastal waterways off the Savannah River. Um, and Davis is also someone who makes it very clear in writing that he does not like the fact that the refugees are following his army. And in fact, he writes back to Sherman saying that he wants to essentially get rid of them. And Davis's method for doing so, which he employs first at a place called Buckhead Creek, which is, I guess we could say it's east of Milledgeville. is that he pulls up the Army's temporary pontoon bridges before the group of refugees, which is probably numbering about 600, maybe, I think is the number that I found, before they get a chance to cross. Fortunately, at Buckhead Creek, disaster is averted, but nonetheless, Davis does this at least once, maybe twice more before disaster strikes at Ebenezer Creek. And at Ebenezer Creek, it's a similar story. The Army crosses, and as soon as they do so, the bridges come up. But unfortunately, just as soon as they do, Joseph Wheeler's Confederate cavalry swings up from behind, barrels into the crowd of refugees stranded on the bank, kills many on the spot, captures and re-enslaves others, sends others into the water where they are fired upon again. Many drown in the melee. Some do make it across, but it's clear that many of those who did make it across lost loved ones in the experience. And this becomes really a one of the defining moments of the entire campaign. And I just want to maybe sort of set the scene for listeners. It is called Ebenezer Creek, but again, this is pretty close to the Savannah River. Um, it is really a cypress swamp with a pretty stiff current with high waters. So it is much more than a stream or a creek. It is truly a bayou with a river-like current running through it, which makes all the difference in this moment, unfortunately.
Wow, and that also points out one of the great values in historical travel. When you go see places like that, you understand better exactly what the name means. We're
Yeah.
talking tonight with Bennett Parten. He's the author of Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. I'm Jerry Prokopovich. This is Civil War Talk Radio. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Civil War Talk Radio. I'm Jerry Prokopovich, talking tonight with Bennett Parten. He is the author of Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March, and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. And we ended our last segment talking about the events at Ebenezer Creek when Union General Jeff C. Davis pulled up the bridges over the creek before the crowd of refugees following his troops could cross. And then Confederate cavalry under Joe Wheeler sweeps in and begins massacring the refugees who either suffer at Wheeler's hands or die trying to cross the creek, many of them. Truly a tragic moment. Uh, the those who survive or those who are following other parts of the army, however, do eventually make it to Savannah, the goal of the campaign. And as your book title says, somewhere toward freedom. It's where are we going? Well, we don't know, just somewhere toward freedom. And you might say the same for the soldiers. They don't know exactly where their general's ordering them. They're just following orders. Well, here's where we're going. We're going to Savannah. Uh, they get there, and now you've got how many refugees end up in Savannah?
Sherman writes back that he imagines there's about 20,000 following his army when he pulls into the outskirts of Savannah.
And his army starts at 60,000. So this is a massive number.
Right.
Now, the question then becomes what's going to happen to them? Where do they go now? They've gotten to, it's not quite the promised land, but are they going to live there? What's going to happen? And one of the people who has something to say about this is a new character shows up. And you're not writing a novel, you're not making up these characters. Here comes Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Uh, what's Stanton doing in Savannah at this time?
Well, ostensibly, he is there to inspect the city and to requisition some of the remaining cotton bales. But Sherman suspects, and this is probably true, by the time the army arrives in Savannah, there is word gets back. I imagine soldiers right back to Washington, D.C., but it's unclear exactly, but word has gotten out about Ebenezer Creek. And there is a narrative on the rise that is a troubling one for someone like Stanton, which is that Sherman allowed this incident to happen, and that Sherman could have liberated even more people had he been willing to follow emancipation or enforce emancipation and see it through, and that he essentially turned his back on the refugees in Georgia. Now, this narrative doesn't come close to matching the accounts that cast him as a conquering hero in Savannah. But nonetheless, for a Secretary of War that is um, uh, wanting to continue to recruit black soldiers, who has to worry about a loud anti-slavery and abolitionist interest in you know, New England and New York and across the North as well. This is a troubling narrative indeed. And so Stanton is there, and while he's there, he begins asking Sherman questions about the nature of emancipation along the march. And at one point, he pulls out a newspaper and specifically asks him about Ebenezer Creek. Sherman denies any wrongdoing. He says it was an incident. He says that it wasn't as bad as what the stories allege. But nonetheless, Stanton is there to essentially find out what happened and to launch a fairly gentle inquisition, I suppose you could say, into Sherman's handling of the incident.
One of the remarkable things that happens here, you describe, is that Stanton then trying to get this information instead of just asking Sherman about Sherman or asking other white American soldiers about Sherman, he goes to the African American community.
Right.
What does he hear from them?
Well, you're absolutely right. He holds a meeting, a very famous meeting with 20 of Savannah's black religious leaders in the Green Mansion here in Savannah on Madison Square. And it's a really remarkable meeting. The 20 black leaders appoint a man named Garrison Frazier, who just 10 years earlier purchased his own freedom and his wife's freedom, and who is now holding court with Stanton and Sherman, two of the most powerful men in the country.
Mm.
And this meeting is ostensibly about matters related to the freedmen of Georgia. But it really becomes something much more. At various times, Stanton asks Frazier to define slavery and freedom. At one point, he asks what Frazier and what freed people expect of freedom, what they want out of freedom. And Fraser's very clear that they want land. They want the independence that comes with owning land. And there's a really remarkable moment where Stanton follows up by asking Fraser essentially, how did you come by your opinions? And Fraser tells him, well, it's talking with my colleagues, but it's also in my ministry with the refugees,
Mm.
whose number is larger than I could have imagined. And this is a striking comment to make because it suggests that these refugees who for so long have been nameless and forgotten in the historical record, nonetheless, by the sheer weight and power of their movements, are effectively here in this meeting, sort of altering the conversation and the nature of this interview that's happening, which is sort of an astounding thing to think about. But then something phenomenal happens, or interesting happens after that, which is that Stanton asked Sherman to leave the room. And he essentially asked the religious leaders what they think of Sherman, and he gets an overwhelming vote of confidence. Sherman apparently met with many of them when he first entered into the city and shook their hands and spoke with them and was very, very respectful of their opinions and really welcomed them when he arrived. And this seemed to go a long way in winning their support. And so Sherman gets a real vote of confidence in this moment. Though he's not happy about it. Even in his
Mm.
memoirs, he writes back with some real grievances against Stanton. Of course, they have a much longer history than just that.
Yeah.
But he knows exactly what's happening, and he's not very happy about it.
But this brings us back to Sherman's ambivalence, where we're going from someone who at the start of the war thinks slavery has nothing to do with it and isn't the problem, Now we find him in Savannah, both getting a vote of confidence from black leadership, and of course, if people know anything about this aspect of the campaign, they've heard of Special Order Number 15, uh, which, as you point out in the book, is usually called Sherman's Special Order 15. Uh, what just to make sure we're all on the same page, what is Special Order 15, and is it really Sherman's?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Order 15 is a directive that Sherman gives, I think 4 days after the meeting with the religious leaders that sets aside requisition plantation land from Charleston in the north to Jacksonville in the south, running about 30 miles inland for exclusively African American homesteading. And you are right. Or let me just back up and say, and this is a pretty remarkable directive to give. Sherman always views it as being politically expedient for him. He views it as a place for the refugees to remain so they won't follow him further into South Carolina when he makes his next movement. Nonetheless, by issuing it, he basically lets the genie out of the bottle when it comes to land reform. And so now suddenly land reform, the idea that former plantation space is going to be turned over to formerly enslaved people, is out of the bottle and is up for debate and is seemingly happening here on the coast. And Jerry, you're right. I mean, it's always known as Sherman Special Field Order Number 15. But it's was clear to me in some of the research that Stanton had a real hand in this.
Mhm.
Uh, he was there with Sherman. I think I remember reading once that he sort of offered some edits. Uh, and then two, we have to recognize that much of the order itself looks a lot like what Fraser recommended in this meeting. And then two, Henry Halleck, an old friend of Sherman's, uh,
Mhm.
who was working at this time, I believe, as the Army's chief of staff in Washington, holding an administrative but a very powerful, important one. Earlier in the year, or earlier in January, before the meeting, he writes down to Sherman and says, "You've got to do something to cover your flanks. You've got to do something." He speculates, well, can't you open up the plantations around Savannah for enslaved people, for these refugees, to have some form of, refuge, some haven for them to go to? And so we can really see the special field orders being less something that emanates directly from Sherman, and more from the sort of conversations he's having with very important are the various important power brokers and stakeholders in this moment.
So now we've got a strip of land, is 30 miles inland between Savannah and Charleston. That includes Hilton Head, Port Royal, the Sea Islands area there. And it the thing is, Port Royal is where freed people have been living on formerly white-owned plantation land for 3 years.
Right.
I guess two and 3 years by this time. Uh, and in some cases have actually purchased the land through tax sales.
Mhm.
So you've got this really remarkable experiment, as Willie Lee Rose's famous book called Rehearsal, she calls it, a rehearsal for Reconstruction, the Port Royal experiment, where black land ownership is taking hold in a large way, and then suddenly all these tens of thousands of refugees are essentially dumped on them,
Uh,
and this is where the Jubilee suddenly turns on its head, and now you've got these people uh, without any resources. It's quite a terrible ending.
it is. And this is something that surprised me in writing this book, Jerry, is that, I'd known both stories, the Port Royal story, as well
Right.
as the story of Sherman's March. And I knew that I had a story when I began doing the research on Emancipation in the wake of the March. And it never quite occurred to me until I just began sort of following it up that these two parallel stories will meet the way that they do. Because you're right, Sherman begins sending the refugees up to Port Royal from Savannah. He thinks it'll be a haven for them.
Mhm.
But what happens is that the arrival of so many refugees in what was previously a self-contained freedmen's colony really turns that colony into the epicenter of a sprawling refugee crisis that will take a really dark turn. There's periods of starvation, there's a lack of housing, there's rates of sickness. And so this moment really ends on a dark, tragic note and really ends in a story about what it is to be a refugee in the middle of wartime and in the aftermath of war, and in this case as well.
Yeah. And listeners will know this as well, knowing their history. It doesn't get any better when the war ends and Andrew Johnson becomes president and reverses Special Order 15 and all the other possessory land grants.
Right. In
But
fact, many of the refugees will turn
yes,
around and journey back to Georgia. Many of the Georgia refugees will. When that
but
happens, Johnson begins restoring land.
with just a minute left, in spite of all that, in your conclusion, you say the way we should remember Sherman's March is coming back to that word jubilee, this remarkable celebratory moment of freedom. Uh, that should be the takeaway.
Yeah, well, I recognize there is some contradiction there and there's some ambiguity, but what it is, I think, the takeaway, because one of the things that became apparent to me in writing this book is that for the month and a half that the march took place, it was a moment of just incredibly robust reimaginings of what freedom could mean after the end of the war on the part of enslaved people, uh, reimagining and looking forward to what freedom could bring for them. And even as this moment takes a really dark turn, as the story transitions to Port Royal, the fact of this refugee movement at all, the fact that it existed the way that it did, will go on to really shape the early stages of Reconstruction. It'll play a large role in what the Freedmen's Bureau looks like, what land reform looks like, as we just discussed. And so I see Sherman's March really as one of these moments where American freedom is being redefined. And in that sense, I think it's clearly a Civil War battle. It's an episode of the Civil War, but I think as an Americans, I think we can also make an argument to sort of see it as one of these moments like Yorktown or Philadelphia in 1776, like Gettysburg, Selma, Alabama, one of these kind of signature moments in American history where what it actually means, that being American freedom, that is really sort of being negotiated and hashed out in real time.
Well, it is a great story. It's a fascinating book, a book one can devour. Listeners, you will absolutely want to read this uh, this work of Bennett Parten called "Somewhere Toward Freedom: Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation." Ben, thank you so much for being on the show tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
And Voice America, thank you for 20 and a half years of collegial cooperation. It has been a great pleasure as well. And going forward, don't go far, listeners. Thank you as always for listening to